This is a special episode of Affinity Talks Gospel. For this episode, Lizzie Harewood is joined by our guest host, Adam May, a communication and ministry consultant. And they're going to be interviewing me, Graham Nicholls, about a book I wrote called Reasoning in the Public Square.
Hello and welcome to the Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. My name is Lizzie Harewood.
And my name's Adam May.
And we are here, unusually, to actually interview Graham Nicholls, rather than him being the interviewer. So, Graham, I'm going to start off in a similar style to you, how you normally start off. Graham, we're here to talk to you about this book, Reasoning in the Public Square. Why does the Christian world need another book? What's it all about?
That is definitely my style of question. Quite aggressive.
Yeah.
I like it. I've taught you well. Well, in a sense, there are probably books that cover some of the material, some places, but I wrote the book particularly because it occurred to me that there are lots of people that we're not currently connecting with through our kind of normal relational and corporate evangelistic efforts, and it got me thinking, because of some of the media work, about how we can connect with people that are outside all those normal connections. And then I thought of some ways in. So it was written with that passion, the idea of the Great Commission, which is to go. And of course, we go when we talk to our friends and relatives and neighbors. We go when we do events at our churches and kids work and all those things. That's part of the going. And we go when we do mission abroad. But the going that I was thinking about was going to people we don't currently connect with. And that got me thinking about streets and street preaching, about politics, about media, the old media, new media, and all kinds of different ways to engage with people. So that was the heart behind the book. And I think just gathering all those together and thinking about some things we might say was a useful exercise. It was good in my thinking. So hopefully it's good for people as they read it.
I love the book because I endorse the book, and I actually say in the bit of the book about the fact that I pray that you will find this book helpful, whether you are a church leader or an individual Christian. Talk to me about why you think there's a difference, because obviously I said those words. I read the book and thought, actually, I could read this as a church leader, but I could also read this as a kind of just a normal Christian. But do you think there's particular different things that you need to read it if you're, reading this as a Christian, if you're reading this as a church leader? Do you think there's different things that we need to hear, or is there just one kind of that goes through both?
Yeah, I did write it with ordinary people in mind, not particularly with sort of professionals, as it were. I'm not really that clever. Obviously, I have some kind of skill sets. I'm not trying to be falsely modest, but I'm not a theologian. I'm not a really deep thinker. So I tried to write how I speak, which I think is fairly simple. And it's not that people are simple, but for people who are not perhaps immersed in thinking deeply about apologetics, I tried to write some things about how you would give simple answers to the basic questions that people always ask. For people who are not necessarily wanting to go on the national media, how could you do some things locally that might break through? For people who don't want to be national politicians, how could you maybe get involved in politics locally? And how could you visit people in your street maybe once every 6 months and say, we're from Christchurch, any place, and what can we pray for you? So I wrote it with everybody in mind. Ordinary people sounds very patronizing, but with any people in mind.
So if you're a professional Christian or an ordinary Christian, this book is for you then.
I'm not professional in the sense that you get paid to do stuff related to work.
I know.
Yeah. But I do wonder though whether there is something about, you talk about the fact that, however good the flyers are, however good the posters are, and sometimes as church leaders we can think that that's what needs to happen, and actually kind of going, do you think there is something? I know you say this is written for the individual or the normal Christian, but actually there may be something in there for church leaders too, and that's why as I read it, I think probably something as a church leader that needs to be heard.
Well, I hope so. Someone in our church who's not a great reader gave me the greatest compliment because she said, "I don't really read Christian books, but this is written in simple English, so I can understand it," which was great. But I also think in the big strategic sweep, of course, church leaders want to lead people in. So hopefully, church leaders will read it and think, "Oh, there's some good ideas in here. I want to try and lead my church in this direction." The reason I said about flyers and posters and everything else, I'm not decrying those at all, and sometimes they do break through. Um, but my point as the book begins is there are so many people in a town like Harewood Heath, where I live, where there's about 30,000 people, 40,000 people with all the new estates going up. And at least half of them don't know a Christian. And even in my experience, as someone who's been here 20 years and know loads of people, walk down the street, can see loads of people, I also don't know loads of people, partly because new people move in, but also because I just haven't met them. And a lot of them don't know a Christian, and they're not connecting. They're not going to see my flyer on social media or outside the church building. My daughter-in-law became a Christian, and we have a community cafe about 2 minutes from where she lives. And the church is about 5 minutes from where she lives. She became a Christian not knowing the cafe or the church, never even noticed it was there. So you're thinking, how are you going to break through when it's just not in someone's interest and gaze? And of course, relational will break through, and they might get connected through the kids' work, and they might get connected through social work and so on. But these other ways are just other avenues of getting to people.
But you use the word marketplace or market as a title for each of your chapters. Now, tell us, where do you get that analogy from? What do you mean by marketplace?
Yeah, when I started thinking about a way to sort of structure the book, I thought about Paul in Athens, and many people go to the famous the speech at the end of Acts 17, where he speaks in the Areopagus and connects with their poets and everything else. And it's a great sermon for reaching people who haven't got any church background. But I wanted to step back from that and say, what got him to that point? It was actually him reasoning in the marketplace, the place where people gather, with the agora. That was the word I was just searching for in my brain. The word agora in Greek, and that was a place where politically, where for entertainment, for judicial sort of judgments to be meted out, and so forth, and trade, where all kinds of people met. And I thought it was just a great concept, an example that Paul goes and reasons every day. It says reasoning in the marketplace, and of course we don't know quite who he reasoned with and how he reasoned and everything else, but we do know he did it regularly where people were meeting for all those reasons. So I thought that is just such a great connection with the marketplace around us, which may be a literal marketplace, it may be literally streets, it may be media, it may be politics, it may be social action of some sort. So yeah, that's the why I keep coming back around on it. And actually, the more I got into the book, the more I thought, in God's amazing providence, it actually worked really well, because it pretty much works with every section of the book. And the fact that there's kind of Greek philosophers works really well, and the fact that there's Greek entertainment, which works really well, and the fact that there was ordinary people there works really well. So yeah, I'm sure God had a better idea than I did when I started the book.
You talk about the fact that we've got good news to share, and I just wonder, as the kind of sitter-inner on this podcast, just talk to me, Graham, a bit about kind of the fact that we have got good news to share, because actually sometimes I think it sounds like a platitude, but actually we do have good news to share.
Yeah, I think it's very hard for Christians. I was listening to some talks actually over the weekend about our witness, and I think there has to be a realism that for spiritual and cultural reasons, cultural battles, we do hesitate. But it's always good to go back to we do really have good news to share, and in most cases we are completely enthusiastic and relaxed about sharing good news. In most cases of good news that's happened to us, we've passed an exam, or we've passed a medical test, our child has achieved something. We're very happy to share good news. When it comes to the gospel, there is a hesitancy, and we need to sometimes reflect on that and to try and break through that. But sometimes we just need to remind ourselves, this is fantastic news. We have this job from God to be ambassadors on behalf of God, appealing to be reconciled to God through the Lord Jesus Christ. And this is such a privilege to be doing that. And so we should be eager to do it. We need to recognize this is hard and it's a challenge, and we don't need to beat ourselves up and feel guilty that we don't always do it. But rather than kind of cajoling ourselves to do it as some kind of obligation, to actually just remind ourselves this is a privilege and it's really good for the people that we're going to speak to. So let's get on with it enthusiastically.
So this is more than just a kind of evangelistic how-to, isn't it? And I think you kind of make it clear in the beginning that that there are those that are kind of full-time gifted evangelists, and this isn't necessarily directed at them in any way, but how to engage the gospel in every area of our lives, our interactions with people, but also not to be afraid of perhaps some of the more old school styles of engaging the gospel literally in the marketplace. Now, I live in a market town, or now I should say a city.
Yeah.
You have a literal marketplace where you will get street preachers. And you say, maybe you've heard that collective groan when a busker gets on your train on the underground, and a street preacher can often provoke even more embarrassment. I kind of feel stuck in that place sometimes between feeling admiration and gratitude to this person who is preaching the word of God. And often I'll listen and I'm thinking, that is ordained by the Lord, because you are preaching the gospel there.
Mm.
And yet I see the kind of expressions on the faces of people walking past. Why are you devoting a whole chapter to street preaching? How can we, should we be spending more time thinking about this kind of, this old school style? Is it old school?
Yeah, I'd say in the book that I literally did begin this chapter thinking I'm going to analyze it and come to a conclusion that it's outdated and not really relevant. And I ended up thinking I need to rethink this. I think I did that through looking at the Bible, through looking at church history, and through talking to a variety of street preachers who were actually as embarrassed by the embarrassing street preachers as you are.
Yeah.
Were really saying to me that there are good ways and not such good ways of doing it. And so it kind of rehabilitated it for me. And I think if it's done well, and it may not necessarily be street preaching in the sense of delivering a sermon, it may be street conversations, it may be going up and asking people questions, it may be doing a bit of drama, it may be doing little soundbite things, or kind of interviews in front of other people. So there's lots of things you could do to communicate. But the people I spoke to were making a point that it can be effective, and it does actually connect with people that you wouldn't normally connect with. And it puts it out there. And they were saying actually it connects with young people more than you would think. And particularly in our kind of post-Christian society, there's lots of young people who don't actually have a prejudice so much against Christianity that the slightly older people have. So for all those reasons, I think it's worth doing. I've done a little bit of street preaching, felt pretty awkward about it, but have done it a bit. I've done more street conversations where you go up to people and you say something like, we're from church name, we're just chatting with people about their faith. Have you heard of the church? Do you have a faith? Those conversations are all right in my experience. They go all right, and that's a kind of street evangelism thing. I've also done door-to-door visiting. I kind of had gone off that a bit, but thinking about it some more, I thought this does connect with people, and particularly if you can do it consistently. Over a 5-year period, if you visited a couple of thousand houses 10 times or something, that's a really good connection, and it's showing people that you care. And even if you just knock on the door and say, we're from church name, how can we pray for you, as you're open, and that's all you say, or here's a flyer that just tells us what's on. You might, have kids that are interested in the kids' work or older people or whatever. I think that's well worth doing. So yeah.
Yeah, I often think
do it.
it helps, doesn't it, that you've got something to hang it on. And aside from, the news that Jesus died to rescue them from from their sins,
Yeah.
but an event or something in particular that they can be invited to, that helps perhaps with some of that slight awkwardness, to begin with, saying, hi, just let you know, we're from the local church. We've got this event on this service on whatever day it is, or this community event. We'd love to see you there. And then they get to know your faith. They get to know that you're not a complete nutter, and we'll welcome them.
Yeah. And I think culture's changed in that more people are at home random times.
Yeah.
Particularly in a commuter town, which used to be a market town where I live, there was a period where most people were out working, commuting to London, out early, back late, or Brighton or somewhere. Whereas now they're working from home a couple of days a week. So, door visiting Monday, Friday is quite a key time, because lots of people just do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, where they're in an office somewhere. So yeah, I would say give it a go.
Yeah, I just wondered if I could just ask the question, Graham, because I did a reflection for Premier Christian Radio. Other Christian radio stations are available. That happened to be for Premier Christian Radio a couple of years ago, and I was sharing on Premier about the fact that I could count on one hand in 10 years of ministry at that point. It was before the pandemic. About how if you ask people if you can pray for them, I can count on one hand the number of times that people have said no. And I just wondered whether you wanted to just paint a bit of a picture in terms of your own, how it's been for you, as you've said to people, can I pray for you? Because you talk about the fact that people would rarely say no. I think that seems to be a common feature. But what is the picture for you, and why do you think people don't say no if we offer to have a conversation and say, how can I pray for you?
I'm not sure I know comprehensively enough, but I think the reasons that is, I think more people are interested in prayer, even if they're not interested in Jesus, and they're people are a bit more. I don't want to make it kind of catastrophize, but people are a bit more harassed and helpless than they were maybe 5 years ago. In terms of cost of living, worry about illness, worry about war, all those sort of things. So although they're not flocking to our churches with saying, what must I do to be saved? I think there is a degree of harassment that people are thinking, well, I'll take all the help I can get. If someone wants to pray for me, that's good. So I think there is a bit of that going on. You and I were at a meeting recently, Adam, where people were talking about how for in various contexts, prison work, student work, and somewhere else that I can't remember, apologetics work generally, that there's more of a spiritual hunger than there seems to have been for quite a while. This was amongst students and prisoners. And so there does seem to be a bit of an uptick. So for all those reasons, do everything that I say in my book. You'll be more fruitful than you would have been 5 years ago, maybe. Under God.
But it is interesting that you talk about the fact that there is that deep-seated hunger. One of the statistics, and being kind of a statistics guy, that jumps out when you talk about it in the introduction to the book about being an invisible church, you say that on an average Sunday, 98% of the UK population are not inside an evangelical church. Now, what's going on in terms of other churches is an interesting thing, and there's a whole range of different statistics. But do you think that as evangelicals, we might get a little bit scared about the fact that 98% of people in the UK are not in our churches on a Sunday?
Not so much scared. I think we need to get just a bit motivated to think that they may be believers through other means, but most of them are lost, and we don't want to get them into our churches just so our churches are bulked out, but we do want them to hear the good news about Jesus, because that's what we want for them as people who love people, and that's what God wants for them, as expressing his heart. So we want to use that as more of a motivation. So it wasn't really to kind of make us feel small or insignificant, but to just drive us to think we're not going to get 98% of people to come into our churches, but we could get a few percent maybe. And as I say, there is this spiritual hunger out there, and we got to think of more ways of reaching people. I love relational evangelism. I love doing evangelistic courses. Got one going on tonight in my house, and I'm doing them all the time. Love it all, as as really encouraging and great ways of connecting with people. But life is short, and heaven and hell are certain, and a lot of people won't be connected with us by our relationship building and our good works in the neighborhood and our old people's work and our kids' work and so on. We need to do that really well, have great pathways, and people will be saved through that as well. But we also need to bounce around in the rest of the town and make a noise, and also across the country. So that's why I talk about some of the other aspects, not just street preaching, but some other things as well about new and old media and so on.
Well, I just wanted to, sorry, Lizzie. I just wanted to pick up on that because you talk in the beginning of chapter 2. You use that scripture that I love from Colossians. I spent last year preaching through the book of Colossians, and I have a new profound love of that verse in Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, where Paul says to the church at Colossae, "Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." It does I know when I preach that, people, and I'm sure, Graham, as you've preached it too, people have kind of come up to you and go, always know how to answer everybody. That seems quite a scary thing, because, what happens if I get it wrong? But actually, it's that thing that Paul talks about first, about being full of grace, seasoned with salt. It's about how we do it. But you then go on after that passage of scripture to then talk about how do we start a conversation. And it's interesting about how people are engaged conversationally now. Do people start conversations using that new media, things like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger? There was some research just this week that the week that we're recording this, that basically says that most young people nowadays are afraid of answering their telephone because they're scared about all of that. So I want to pose the question that you pose in the book, and maybe ask for you to answer it, Graham. How do we start a conversation with all of these different ways in which we can do that?
Well, I think by saying something engaging, or by asking a question that engages. So, and I talk a little bit in the book about questions. I stumbled upon a statistic after I had the book published about, which is stupid that I didn't add it out myself, but about precisely how many questions Jesus asks actually in the Gospels. I knew what Jesus asked a lot, but I just happened to stumble on some statistic which was exactly how many. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but it's a great way in asking questions. Making propositions can be helpful, making statements, but often there needs to be the question behind the statement. So it's better to answer questions than just to make a load of propositions. But asking questions can sometimes provoke, questions back. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does. But asking questions is great because it calibrates where the person is at that you're talking to. And of course, you can do that on a personal one-to-one level, and it's a great way to evangelize, asking questions. But you can do that as well in social media. You can do it in preaching as well, actually. But asking questions is a way of getting engagement, which is different to saying marriage is good. So I did something today about marriage, and the government possibly wanting to sort of sponsor marriage. So you can post that by saying, I think marriage is good, or you can post that by saying, the government wants to subsidize people getting married. What do you think? You're then actually saying, I'm interested in what you think, because you are. But when people start to answer that, then they've engaged, and they're starting to give an opinion and thinking this topic interests me. And then you've got something to kind of work with. And even by asking the question, they might say, well, I wonder what you think. So they look, so they click through and read the article. Anyway, it's not that I'm an expert in the book. Mostly I'm just saying, I think we could do this better. I know I've gone off the question slightly, but
No, I'd like to pick up on that actually, because I'd like to focus just for a moment on the use of social media, because it's so massive, isn't it? And we know so many Christians who use it. We know many Christians who use it well, many Christians who perhaps aren't as wise. So my husband takes the opinion that whatever good you can do on social media as a Christian, it can be undone by many others who are unwise, and he steers clear of it altogether. Although I do notice he sometimes looks over my shoulder when I'm looking through Twitter or Facebook. But anyway, that's a little secret. But so what's interesting is you say at the very beginning that Paul didn't give up at the first hurdle. He went back every day, bringing more evidence, answering more questions.
Yes.
Should that be our approach? Do you think on social media we kind of put something out, we perhaps create some kind of, I wouldn't say provocation, but we put out a question perhaps? Should we be going back to it? Should we be responding to every kind of jibe or disagreement? Can it sometimes undo some of the good that could have been done if we had just left it to kind of hang there?
I think social media for Christians to other Christians is pretty ineffective. So I think if people want to have debates on social media, I think they're fooling themselves about it being useful. But I do think it can be useful evangelistically, and I think there is good and bad ways of doing that. And however you do it, I think consistency is really important. I know one or two churches that do it really well with attractive looking pictures, advertising that's going on, and little mini interviews and so on. And what's really good about it is they're consistent, a consistent brand, and consistently are posting. So they don't post kind of, they post at Christmas and then you see them again at Easter. They're doing stuff all the time. And I think this is a massive opportunity for cleverer people than me to do some work. There are one or two organizations who do it quite well and who try and get right across platforms, from the more visually based platforms, through to sort of Facebook and so on. But there's loads more people could be doing loads more. Every church leader should be able to record a less than a minute video short saying something or other interesting and just put it out there once a week, put it out there every day. It's really not that difficult with technology, and eventually someone might buy it, someone might show an interest. As for engaging, I've occasionally engaged with other Christians who disagree, but it doesn't normally get you anywhere. But sometimes engaging with people who aren't Christians, it's not about them themselves, although you do hope and pray you would have some kind of breakthrough with them. By the gracious way that you're responding, you're witnessing to a whole load of other people who are watching what you're writing, what you're saying. And I try really hard to be gracious and generous when I'm writing stuff, when I'm engaging on social media with people's critiques. And I'm just hoping people are watching that and thinking, this guy believes something and acts consistently with it to some degree. So maybe Jesus is worth investigating.
I wonder whether, Graham, we talked about the fact that this book is for your average Christian, and it's a fantastic book, and I love the fact that, and hopefully Lizzie and I will pick up in a few minutes about the fact that in each of the sections of the book, in each of the chapters, you finish each chapter with a set of questions for us to reflect on. But I did say back a little while ago about the fact that actually the reason I put in the endorsement is I think I pray that this book will help you, whether you're an average Christian or a church leader, because I think that's something that is needed to be grappled with, and particularly in that whole area of social media where we're talking about it. There are an awful lot. Now, I'm not going to name names. I'm sure you wouldn't either. And I'm sure, actually, maybe, Graham, you connect with a better class of church leader than I do. But I do hear and see church leaders that say, I want to use social media in a way that can make me famous. And actually, you talk in there about how we need to be really careful about how we use social media. So how can church leaders use social media in a way, and how can as people who maybe go to a particular church or are following a particular Christian leader? Because, we know that social media helps elevate and extend the reach. You talk about that in the sections on social media, but how can we use social media both as a church leader, but also following church leaders, so that that gospel, that reasoning in the public square gets out there?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who doesn't necessarily produce content, it's always good to like and share stuff from churches. It's surprising how much of an uphill struggle it is to get your own church members to like and share stuff, and they're basically on site. So it all helps with the algorithms. I mean, the simple answer, really, Adam, is to put engaging content on. That's the simplest answer. The harder question is, what is engaging content? But you can think through, what would you click on, and what would you click past, what would you ignore, and what might you watch? And I know you're a Christian asking this question, but it roughly speaking, the same things work. And so just producing really good content. I mean, a point on social media that I make in the book, I interviewed a couple of people from our church, and I can't remember how many hours, 48 hours or whatever they'd spent on TikTok. It was a half-term week, so they made that as an excuse. It was a phenomenal amount of time. And these guys I spoke to, and I took the average of the two of them, just to be slightly generous. And they come to our church. They're Christians. They're kind of mid-teens. We get them for, I don't know, an hour on a Sunday, in terms of sort of teaching content. And they go to a weeknight thing as well. So let's say 2 hours worth of teaching, 48 hours worth of TikTok. That's quite a competition. What if you somehow got in their space, in their TikTok space? It's a hard challenge, but what if you were in there as well, engaging? Most of them are not picking up news from news channels. They're picking up kind of news headlines-ish from their various social media platforms. We need to think about how we find a way into that. That is a marketplace. They're spending hours and hours on this, not necessarily destructively, but that's what they're spending a lot of time doing. So how can we break into that? How can we get the algorithms to follow us, but without going for conflict? Because conflict often drives the algorithms up, but there are other things that drive the algorithms up to do with engagement, and we want people to engage. I don't know what the answer is. I just know we should do it.
I think in terms of Adam, your kind of point about seeking to be famous, I think that's just a small symptom of what's gone wrong with so many leaders, that their profile and their reputation and the power linked to that is more important than actually the message, the changeless message.
It's really interesting. Let me just tell you a quick story. A couple of years ago, because I have the privilege of not just working with Affinity, but working with a whole range of different Christian organizations and leaders all over the UK church, I get to see bits of picture. But somebody was introduced to me by a Christian leader that I was working with. And so, because this Christian leader said, I want you to meet X individual, I won't name who they are. I thought, when the email came through, I thought, okay, that's the one I want to go and have coffee. Back in the days when you actually went and had coffee in London. So I went and had coffee. And I was talking to this particular Christian leader. And we were in the position where I said, how can I help you? And they said, all I want to do is become famous. And I said, that's not what I'm in the business of. I want to make sure, as you were saying, Lizzie, that timeless message is actually what gets out. But it's really interesting that you kind of buy into the fact that actually, I need to extend my reach. And you kind of fall and you slip into that culture of celebrity. There are people like that person that I was introduced to who very much wanted to make their name as a Christian leader, but also, it is so easy to fall into that place whereby you end up becoming that leader by default. And yet there is power in knowing that Christian message. Graham, you talk about the fact that God uses the feebleness of our hands in the book, and I love that. And so it was for me just wanting to think about, where is the line in terms of actively seeking it, and yet realizing that even some of that stuff that we do maybe weekly, but over time we begin to grow and develop, then actually we need to know where the line is.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because obviously only God knows our hearts, and there's a degree of inconsistency in all of us, and ego and so forth. It connects with actually this podcast itself, because there is a part of me that says I should be a humble Christian who kind of says of my book, it's out there. I don't think it's particularly good because I'm not very good. And read it or not, do what you want. And the publisher, who's a Christian publisher, was really helpful and said, under God, you've been given this ability to write this book, and you spent quite a few weeks of your life slaving over it. You hope it will help the church. Be positive about it. Say it's a good book, because you think it is a good book and it's worth reading. And it's similar in lots of ways, that you want people to come to your church because you want them to hear the gospel and you want them to know Christ, and you think that's good. But you also think some of the things you're doing as church are good, and you think, well, what you believe as church is good. And I think it's all connected with motivation. If you want people to read your book or come to your church to make you feel better about yourself, then that's just a road to destruction for yourself, and it's not going to help them. If you want them to read this book, come to this meeting, be part of your church, because you think it's connecting them with the God of the universe and it will do them good, and you want them to come there because you love people, if that's the primary driver, even with all the models of everything else, then it's okay to kind of sell and to figure out, okay, what's going to get me the most engagement on social media, what's going to get the most people kind of following it. If it's not about I want them to do that so they like me, but you think I want them to do that so they'll somehow connect with this bit of content and that will do them good, that's what we got to be thinking.
I think that's a good lesson to anyone who's got any kind of responsibility for delivering a message.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I just wonder whether, Graham, you want to talk about why you think at the end of every chapter it is important to give us something to think about. Why in every section? Because some people kind of just go, we read text and then we kind of move on. But actually in this book, you're putting points in after every chapter. Why is that important? Why was that important when you put the book together?
It's a practice we have in our church, and it's something I like in books, even though I may not answer diligently every question. I like the idea that you get to an end of a chapter and you may have been concentrating or you may have been drifting a bit, and you get to the end and the questions kind of make you think, oh, did I understand any of this? Have I absorbed any of it? So I think it partly kind of helps you revise the material, but it also helps you think, okay, what am I going to do as a consequence? What is the hardest question? What could I do? What can I get involved in locally? So it's a bit of a call to action as well. So it's partly a bit of revision and partly a bit of let's go forward and think, well, can we do something out of reading this chapter? Because I've just wasted 5 minutes of my life reading this. If it has no effect on me, if I didn't absorb it and it's not going to change anything in my thinking at all, then what was the point? But if it just incrementally changes a little bit, my thoughts, my sympathy for street preachers, my thought that maybe I'll be a school governor or someone else can be, or I'll get involved in local politics, or I'll, help start a food bank, or I'll, support Park Run or something, somehow to get engaged, or I'll start sending thought for the week to my local newspaper. If anything comes out of it, then that's good.
Well, you're a practical kind of guy, aren't you, Graham? So I think, as you say, you're a normal guy. You're not trying to be a theologian. You're just trying to get some outcome, at the coal face. So I really appreciated that. So one of the questions in the book, and I think this is a good one to then pose back to you, is this: what is the hardest question you get asked, or you worry about being asked in a public setting? Because you must have been asked quite a few difficult questions for years.
I've done a few interviews and people always ask me that question. They obviously a light on it. It obviously is a bit of a beacon in the book. I think the hardest question is questions about suffering, around suffering. The questions about sexuality are awkward. Occasionally questions about, creation and, I don't know, genocide in the Old Testament. So some of those are a bit difficult, but actually the one about suffering is the hardest, because in the end we don't have an answer. On all the other areas we have an answer. When it comes to suffering, we have to carefully navigate sympathy for someone who perhaps is asking it from a position of being in suffering, or having someone, suffering next to them, as it were. We have to recognize that we live in a broken world, and that's part of the cause for it. To recognize that sometimes suffering is caused by our own, directly by our own sin, not just by the fact that we're in a fallen world. But we can answer all those things. But people who are thinkers will always come back with, yeah, but why did that happen? And the best I can do is take people back to the illustration of the of the child who sees some adult coming towards them with this sharp instrument, and or they're a baby, sorry, someone comes towards them with a sharp instrument, and they raise their hand and they stab them with this sharp instrument, and the baby's crying their head off. And only you, as the adult observing from a distance, can see that they're getting a vaccination, or they're getting some injection going to help them. That child is not going to be able to comprehend what's happening. And I think that is an answer, but it's not an answer. So it's a really hard question, the question about suffering. But it's also a really good question in the end, because part of becoming a Christian is accepting that we can't have all the answers that we want. So actually getting people to get on the edge of the precipice and say, some of this involves me trusting God and getting to the end of my questions. I think it's all right as a Christian not to have the answers to all of people's questions. You can just point them to Jesus and say, he suffered, he understands suffering. But I can't answer the question about why you're suffering or why there is suffering. So anyway, that's the hardest one. I don't know if you find that the hardest question, but it's the hardest one I get. Don't get asked it much on media, though. I get asked that much more at a personal level, pastoral situations, evangelistic courses, and other sort of apologetic-y type of engagements.
And the book does cover a few different apologetic kind of topics reasonably briefly. It's quite helpful, though. I found a few of your tips, really helpful. So I would definitely recommend going in if you need a bit of a brush up on some apologetics. That's a quick chapter you can read.
Yeah, I found it helpful. It kind of grew out of something in my church where it was to do with sexual ethics, actually, but I did a quick kind of 10-point, here's 10 typical questions and here's some answers. And people said that was really helpful. And I was thinking, well, there's loads of other books that have this kind of in longhand, but people seem to appreciate a paragraph or less, just saying, here's where you could start to answer this. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully people will find that helpful as well.
Helpful.
I was just going to ask you, as we come towards the end of our time, Graham, what's the hardest question you think you've been asked on the media? Because I sit and listen as the PR consultant for Affinity. I sit and listen to every media interview you do. I've listened to you for hours, and there was one a couple of summers ago where I was sitting there and I was texting the producer going, this is completely off script. You might remember the interview that you did with James Whale. But what for you, Graham, is the hardest question you think you've been asked on the media?
The one that you're talking about, I think, was, what if your daughter was gay? Is that the one?
That was the one.
Yeah. So it was, you have a daughter, do you? And I said, yeah. And what if she said she was gay? I'm not sure that was an awkward question, but I think I answered that one okay. I'm not sure I know what the hardest question I've ever been asked is. It normally is around the area of sexual ethics, and in the kind of region of God hates me, or God made me this way, how can he hate me? Those kind of questions are probably the more difficult. Did you have an answer to your own question, Adam, from listening to me?
I didn't, because, as I say, I've listened to you for hours over the years in all of your interviews, and it's always interesting because actually every interview is different. And I think not just for those that have the opportunity to go on to media and engage with media, whether that be in written or broadcast, but actually for all of us, actually that every conversation is different. And again, I drew that from the the book that actually we just need to have a go. And that's what I love about this book. That's why I think it's so practical, and I think it's a good thing for both those that are individual Christians, but also those who are church leaders. Because sometimes maybe as a church leader thinking, do you know what, I need to maybe give this a go. It's easier to tell other people to do it, but actually I need to go and give it a go myself, because every conversation and every circumstance is different.
Absolutely. And I know we're nearly out of time, but what I wanted to really encourage people to think about is you are not an absolute expert, but relatively speaking, you're an expert in Christianity. If you're an average Christian in an average church, you know a bit about apologetics, you know a bit about philosophy, you know a bit about literature, and you know about history, and you've probably come across most of the questions that people will ask you. Your pastor, your youth leader or whatever have gone through those questions in a way that people outside the church have not gone through. Most people haven't studied philosophy and have a whole load of answers. They've got a few stock things that they want to say. What about the dinosaurs? What about suffering or whatever? But they haven't really thought through much beyond that, because they're just busy living their lives. So don't feel woefully inadequate. You have the Bible, you have the Holy Spirit with you, but in God's goodness, you've been educated quite well in most cases. So you can have a conversation, and never be afraid to say, I don't know. You can't really do that on media, but in conversation, it's all right to say, I don't know.
That would be a bit of a car crash.
I've never had a question where I completely don't know. Sometimes you have to sort of divert. I always say as well, prepare, but don't prepare too much. I mean, I never prepare much for interviews, because
yeah.
Otherwise you wouldn't. You want to come out spontaneous. You want to actually have a conversation with the person who's interviewing you, like they're your friend in a pub or a coffee shop. Yeah. That's what I think is the best approach for me. I know other people are different, but that's how I can do it best. So yeah.
So Graham, how do we, as we come towards the end of our time, thank you so much, by the way, for your time. But how do people get hold of the book, Reasoning in the Public Square, Delivering the Changeless Message Through Ever-Changing Media? How do people get hold of the book?
Get hold of it from the publisher Christian Focused Publications, but also on all the Christian bookshops online and in person, and Amazon and all those other kind of places. There will eventually be an audiobook when I've audioed it. But buy the paper version while you can.
Excellent.
Give me feedback. You can find me on the Affinity website. So if you read it and benefit from it, give me some feedback. If you read it and don't like it, tell me that as well.
And send Graham all your tricky questions. That'll help him practice.
Thank you for asking me about it all.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for listening to Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. Affinity is a network of evangelical churches and Christian organizations working together, sharing stories in order to encourage and equip God's people to preach and live the gospel in this generation. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, we'd love you to join us. Just head over to affinity.org.uk/join to find out more. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Affinity Talks Gospel